It is my great delight to be able to introduce and host Caroline Curvan, the current Ossining Town Historian since January 2023. She's going to be talking to us about her latest historical crush, the Agate siblings. But let me tell you a little bit about Caroline. First of all, when she's not literally running around Ossining gathering content for her wonderful blog, Ossining History on the Run, she's researching and writing, which she does professionally. She also teaches English composition. She has been a stage manager for Broadway shows. Last year, she, with Scott Craven, wrote a wonderful book, Croton Point Park, Westchester's Jewel on the Hudson. There we go. She speaks widely in the area. She's spoken at many historical societies and libraries. She's been at Chatham and Hudson Valley Books for Humanity. And so she's around, and I hope you've had a chance to hear her speak at the Ossining Public Library, where she did a set of 3 lectures on the history of Ossining earlier this year. But again, tonight, what we're going to hear about is the Agate family, who is one of the early families of Sparta, and they lived at 2 Liberty Street, which is a house that is still standing. And I'm not going to tell you anything more because she's found some really wonderful stuff. So I'd like to turn it over tonight to Caroline. Take it away, Caroline.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Can you all see just my slides, Martha?
Good.
Confirm?
Good.
Okay. You don't see my notes. Excellent.
Yeah.
All right. Yes, this is my latest crush. I have to say, I am in love with the Agates of Sparta, Frederick, Alfred, and Harriet. They are, first of all, I just want to thank everybody, thank the Jug for letting me do this, and thank everybody who's shown up tonight. I will try not to go on too long, but it's sort of hard because I've fallen down a hole here. Before I get started, though, I want to do a land acknowledgement, and I want to acknowledge that even though we are all zooming in, the Jug Tavern is on the ancestral homelands of the Sint-Sink people, a Munsee-speaking Lenape people. The Sint-Sink ceded their land to Frederick Phillips in 1685 and were forced from the area soon after. And today we believe that many of their community reside in Wisconsin, Oklahoma, and Ontario. And we pay respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging, as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. Thank you. All right, let me just start off with this big red slide, this disclaimer. I am not an art historian. I am not going to be talking about the art really here. I stumbled upon the Agates while I was researching. Hang on, I have to close this. I was stumbling upon the Agates when I researched something completely different at the Ossining Historical Society, as one does. But their stories intrigued me, and the further I went down the rabbit hole, the more obsessed I became. It involved like a pile of paintings that were hidden in an attic for decades. I traveled down to Washington, D.C. to go to the Smithsonian Archives of American Art, as well as all the way to Newark, New Jersey, to see other paintings. A lot of the paintings I'm going to show you were donated to the Ossining Historical Society in 1959 by Melodia Carmichael Wood Ferguson, also known as Mrs. C. Donald Ferguson, who was the great-great-granddaughter of Harriet Agate and the neat great-great-grandniece to Fred and Alfred. She found a lot of these paintings in her mother's attic, donated them all to the Ossining Historical, who then went and redonated them to other museums. But the Ossining Historical still does have a few. So let's get started and just talk about the Agate family. So here, as Martha said, here's the Agate house in Sparta at 2 Liberty Street. This is still standing. I took this photo just about a month or so ago. This was built by Thomas Agate sometime before 1820. He moved to Sparta in 1795 with his siblings, John, William, and Anne and Mary. They emigrated from England. They purchased land from somebody named James Drowley, who was a minister in the General Baptist Society. We believe he was trying to start up a sort of a not a commune, but a collection of people who were like-minded, who were perhaps suffering from religious persecution in England. So a lot of the early people who came to Sparta were from England. Thomas Agate, he began his life in Sparta by keeping a house of entertainment, whatever that means. And then he became the storekeeper of Sparta. And from reading his will, we can find out he was quite an astute businessman and quite successful. He had shares in the copper mines that were there, and the copper that was discovered in 1820. He bought Sparta Dock. He bought several parcels of land, and he was quite well off. And when he died, he was able to leave his wife well off, his wife Hannah, and also their remaining children. So we have this painting. This is the first painting that was found in the attic of Mabel Melodia Foster Wood at 6 Agate Avenue and was donated to the Ossining Historical Society. All we know about it is that it is called Gentlemen of the Agate Family. Family legend has that it is Thomas, and it was painted by Frederick in about the 1820s. Possibly when I went to the New York Historical Society off-site storage unit in Newark, New Jersey, the curator and I sort of decided, Thomas Agate would have been about 50 years old when this painting was done. If it is of him, this seems like it might be of a younger man, but who knows? Let's just say it's Thomas, because why not? Also, here's a picture I just took this afternoon of 6 Agate Avenue, where all these paintings I'm showing you were sitting up in the attic of this very house. Anyway, the first person we're going to talk about is Frederick. Frederick Styles Agate. He was one of four, we believe, 4 children of Thomas and Hannah. Not the oldest, but certainly the premier artist. He was born in 1803. Now, most of the information I have about him comes from his obituary, which was written in 1844. It was published in the Knickerbocker, which was a very popular New York monthly magazine. And it was written by Francis Edmonds, who was a student and a contemporary of Frederick, and also a banker. What we know about Frederick was that he was apparently a very precocious and talented child, drawing horses and ships and cattle and people. When he was about 15 years old, he was encouraged by William Rawlinson, an English engraver, to go to study in New York City. Not quite sure how William Rawlinson gets connected to the Agate family. Perhaps it has something to do with the fact that they came from the same area in England. I haven't quite figured that out yet. But Frederick does go to New York City, and he studies with a teacher named John Reuben Smith. And there he meets Thomas Cummings, who is going to become important in Frederick's life. Here we have a self-portrait. Oh, I should have pointed out, I'm sorry, that this picture that I have of Frederick is actually a self-portrait, we believe, that was done in about 1840. And this is courtesy of the National Academy of Design. They have this in their e-museum. And I love self-portraits because I feel that you really get a sense of the artist, because this is who the artist wants you to see. So moving on to John Reuben Smith, this is who he wants you to see of him. And this is Frederick's first teacher. John Reuben Smith was, he was English born, he was a printmaker, he was an art teacher, and he traveled throughout the United States from about 1807 to 1844, making drawings of buildings, factories, monuments, people. And he was known, according to Thomas Cummings, who was also one of his students, he was known for his rare and spicy witticisms. And I think you can sort of see that in his face. Here's just one example of John Reuben Smith's work. This is old Boston Beacon Hill. This is one of his many, many pictures that he did of early America. So in about 1825, Frederick and Thomas Cummings leave John Smith and go to study with this gentleman, Samuel Finley Breeze Morse, at the Academy of Fine Arts. Now, I had no idea. This is the same Samuel Morse who invented the Morse code and the magnetic telegraph. I had no idea that he began as an oil painter and an art teacher. Samuel Morse studied at the Phillips Academy at Yale College. He studied math and science with Benjamin Silliman. He then went and studied painting with Washington Allston, who was a pioneer of romantic American landscape painting and an inspiration to Ralph Waldo Emerson and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, just to drop a few names. Then Samuel Morse comes back to America, and he goes around and starts painting portraits of all sorts of people involved with the revolution. But first, I want to show this painting that he did of Benjamin Silliman, who was Morse's professor at Yale and often credited as the first official professor of science. He was hired in 1802 to teach chemistry and natural history, and he founded the American Journal of Science. Prior to this, you know, especially in America, science was kind of the purview of wealthy dilettantes. You know, Benjamin Franklin, anyone? Silliman was an interesting guy. He was an abolitionist. He allowed women to attend his lectures. And the story goes that he convinced Frederick P. Barnard of Columbia University to create a college for women, which did happen in 1889. And that's how we have Barnard College today. This is actually a very poor reproduction of this Morse portrait of Silliman. Yale University was not able to provide me with a better one, but luckily his student Frederick Agate did a copy of that painting, and we actually have a much better version here. I'm not sure if it's better than Morse's, but at least it's in color and is at least a little sharper. This was one of the paintings that was up in the attic, and I went and saw it at the Newark Museum because the Ossining Historical Society donated it to Newark in 1959. But part of artistic training in those days was copying the paintings of the great masters or your teachers. Here's another painting of Morse's, of the House of Representatives. And he also painted people like John Adams, James Monroe, Marquis de Lafayette. I think he kind of wanted to be seen as, you know, the painter of the revolution. But alas, that was this gentleman, John Trumbull, who was the president of the Academy of Fine Arts. And so this is where Morse was teaching, and that's where Frederick and Thomas Cummings were studying in about 1825. This is also a self-portrait of the artist. This is John Trumbull's self-portrait of 1802. Now, John Trumbull was known as the painter of the Revolution, and he was president of the Academy of Fine Arts from about 1816 to 1836. And the mission of the Academy was to encourage teaching and appreciation of the classical style. And Trumbull was known as a strict classical traditionalist. He was seen as overbearing, and some felt disrespectful to the younger painters. Get back to that in a moment. I do think that this painting that he painted of himself does seem like someone who's a bit overbearing, and perhaps that's what he wanted you to think. But let me show you just a couple of other paintings of John Trumbull, because I know you've seen them. Here's the Declaration of Independence, 1819, hanged in the US Capitol Rotunda. It's also on the back of the $2 bill. This is one of the paintings they were very worried about during the January 6th riots, but luckily this painting was not damaged. Here's another one you've probably seen, George Washington resigning his commission. It was painted in 1824. Now, remember, back in those days, of course, there were no photos of classical art. There was no way to look at it. You either had to go to Europe and see the paintings themselves or be lucky enough to have some copies. So the Academy of Fine Arts had their own private museum for students with copies of paintings and imported casts of sculptures. And so this is what the students would learn from. So the story goes that the students were only allowed to access these paintings at very at times that were very hard to get to. So they could only get to them for, let's say, from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. in the morning or 8 to 10 at night. And it was very difficult for them to get in because often the doors would just be locked. So there was an incident where Thomas Cummings and Frederick Agate were excluded from the studio. They'd gotten there at 6 a.m. They weren't allowed in. At some point, they actually ran across John Trumbull and they sort of complained to him about this. They thought it was not fair. They were trying to do work. They couldn't get in. And John Trumbull apparently said to them, "The young gentlemen should remember that beggars cannot be choosers." And this infuriated them. So they raced back and they were going to write up a petition to get everybody else to sign it. And then when they talked to Samuel Morse, Morse said, look, why don't we just start our own drawing club in my studios? Which they did. And then this turned into the National Academy of Design. So in 1825, they started putting together this National Academy of Design. Everybody left the Academy of Fine Arts and started coming to the National Academy of Design. And their mission was to promote the fine arts in America through instruction and exhibition. And it's actually still in existence today. It's mostly an honorary organization. They no longer have a school. They no longer have exhibitions, but you have to be asked to join, and it's limited to 450 artists. But our Frederick Agate was an early member, and he taught there, and he was very involved in it throughout. One of the first people to join, I mean, Samuel Morse was the first president, but was Hugh Reinagel. And I point him out because his painting, The Village of Sing Sing, which was painted in 1830, is actually hanging on the walls of the Ossining Historical Society of Museum. So some of the early members are people you will have heard of from the Hudson River School of Painting, people like Asher Durand and Thomas Cole. Obviously, Hugh Reinagel were some.
Durand. That's who Nancy did her thesis.
Sorry,
Really?
Somebody's talking, and I'm not sure what they're saying. All right, I'm just going to go on. Some of the other members, early members, James Fenimore Cooper was a member of the National Academy. John James Audubon, even Louis Daguerre came over from France to become a member. But let's get back to Frederick. Here's an early painting of Frederick's. This was something he might have painted. That's believed he painted it even before he moved over to study with Samuel Morse. This is Mother lamenting over her child. He probably painted this in about 1824. It's based on a poem by the 18th century poet George Pickering, which you're lucky I have not found a copy of that poem. Otherwise, I would have read it to you. I love this painting, but I wish that I could see it in person because I feel the greenish tint is probably not what it was meant to have. But this was one of the paintings that Frederick would have exhibited at the National Academy of Design in 1828. That was one of 11 he would have exhibited that year. Here's another painting. This is Boy of the Agate family. We don't know who painted this. It was that one of those found in the attic. They don't even have family lore of who painted it, but it was probably either Frederick or Alfred. In 1827, Frederick leaves Samuel Morse and sets up a studio at 152 Broadway as a historical and portrait painter, and he's quite successful. And here's one of the paintings he did when he started off. This is Edwin Forrest in the role of Metamora, and he painted this in about 1832. So Edwin Forrest was one of the actors of the day, and as sort of a PR stunt, he offered a prize of $500 if someone could write an original play for him, which was a tragedy in 5 acts in which the hero shall be an aboriginal of this country. And so a young man named John Augustus Stone wrote a play called The Last of Wampanoags. Metamora was the chief. Edwin Forrest took the role. And it was a sympathetic look at the plight of the Indians in America. And I love this because this sort of reminds us of the context of where we are. Because in 1832, Andrew Jackson is president. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 had just been passed, and all the Native Americans were moved west of the Mississippi and forced to give up their land. And so this was a very sympathetic look, and it makes you remember that not everybody was, on board with what was happening with the indigenous people in America at that time. So after he paints this in 1834, he finally gets to go to Europe to see the old masters in person. He makes copies of them. He has a patron who he sends these copies home to. He studies in Paris. He studies in Genoa and Florence. But unfortunately, he gets tuberculosis, as one did in those days. And so he heads back to New York. His friends put him on a boat. They don't even think he's going to survive the voyage, but something about the bracing sea air sort of helped him. And he got back to New York alive and actually went home. And we think he stayed at 2 Liberty and was taken care of by his mother. And he recovers from his tuberculosis. And then he goes on to paint some more paintings and get very involved in the National Academy of Art. Here's a painting that he did. It's an awful picture of this painting. It's living in the New York Historical Society off-site storage, but when I went to go see it, they weren't able to show it to me. But after I went and looked at other paintings, they said, well, if you come back, we'll show you Columbus and the egg. I haven't made it out to Newark yet again, but this is a scene actually from Washington Irving's A History of the Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus, which he wrote in 1828. And if you know anything about Washington Irving, his histories are much more like fictions. And this is a scene from the book in which Christopher Columbus was supposedly told, don't even bother to try to find new trade routes. You have as much chance of finding a new trade route as you have of balancing that egg on its point. And the story goes that Columbus cracked the egg just a little bit so he could make it stand up. And this is some sort of a parable that shows what an inventive fellow he was and how he couldn't be stopped. So our Frederick, he's elected to the National Academy, a ruling council. He becomes the curator, the keeper of all the academy. He manages the school and property. His good friend Thomas Cummings says he was not very good at it because he was far too amiable. He was also an instructor of drawing, a professor of perspective, which sounds like something out of Harry Potter to me. And sadly, in 1844, he dies, presumably of tuberculosis, in Sparta at 2 Liberty Street. According to his friend Thomas Cummings, he died at the residence of his brother-in-law, Mr. Carmichael, which would have been where his sister Harriet was living and probably where his mother Hannah was also living at the time. And he was buried in Sparta, or he is buried in Sparta. Unfortunately, his headstone seems to have gone missing, but we do know where he was buried. And I'm going to do something that you're never supposed to do when giving a presentation. I'm going to read to you from a slide. And this is an excerpt from his 4-page obituary in the Knickerbocker, which was written by Francis Edmonds. Now, of course, an obituary is going to be positive, but I do think there's a number of things in here that are quite interesting and give little bits of insight into who Frederick was. It says he was the model of a truly pure and virtuous man, a single man always in his studio with no disposition to indulge in extravagant pleasures. He was ever willing to receive advice even from those who were not equal to himself in ability and who were far behind him in knowledge and experience. He believed that painting was not merely an ornamental art, but that it could be made an instrument to instruct the mind, refine the feelings, and elevate the character. If he is not ranked hereafter among the first of painters, he will be remembered for his efforts to preserve the noble art to which he was devoted from all contaminations of a false or pernicious character. And I just like that because it just gives you a little insight, perhaps. He seemed like just a very amiable and very well-liked fellow. And it was sad he died so young. So that's our Frederick. Now, the next one I really have a crush on. Alfred Thomas Agate. Look at that punum. Oh, I love him. He's so cute. This painting, I've sometimes seen that this is a self-portrait, but the family lore is that this is a painting painted by brother Frederick Agate in 1838, right before Alfred left for the United States exploring expedition. And there are just a couple things I want to point out about this. You can see he's carrying a little sketchbook under his arm, and he's got these gold buttons. Here we have a close-up of said red sketchbook. And I don't know if you can see it here on the Zoom, but he has little anchors on his gold buttons. And this was likely a jacket he had made for himself, but right before he went on this big exploring expedition. But before we get there, we got to talk about the painting he was doing. He probably was originally taught by Frederick. He then went into the city and he studied with Thomas Cummings, Frederick's good friend. And by the 1830s, he was exhibiting his work at the National Academy. He did a lot of miniatures, and here's an example of one of his miniatures. This is a tiny 3-inch by 3-inch painting that he did of Robert Coleman. This is sadly a posthumously painted picture of a 4-year-old child that is in the Yale University Museum. Here are another couple of miniatures that he did. These are black and white, but they would have been in color. These come from the Frick Digital Collection, which is a magnificent collection. They have images of just about anything, of lots of things that are in private hands that you can't see. These miniatures were owned by Melodia Ferguson, and she had them in her possession. I just hope they're somewhere still in the family. But these were done by our Alfred. Here's another painting Alfred did of William Edmund Armitage in about 1835. This is of a healthy child, and this man went on to become Bishop of the Episcopal Church. Just 2 more paintings here. This is Sidney James Barculo. This was probably one of Alfred's last portraits that he would have painted. This is the son of the New York State Supreme Court Justice Seward Barculo. Sadly, Sidney James did not live very long. He died at 12. I was sad to learn from the Frick Museum's notes that while playing, Sidney and another boy ran into each other, and Sidney was struck on the temple and died within an hour. But at least he had an Alfred Agate painting of himself for his parents to remember him by. And then we have this boy of the Agate family, which I'm showing to you again, because I don't know, after seeing all those paintings of children's, of young boys that Alfred did, I sort of wonder if maybe this was also an Alfred Agate painting. We'll never know, but perhaps it is. Again, these are all paintings that were, a lot of these were paintings that were found in that attic of 6 Agate Avenue. Here's something which I know you can't read, and I'm just showing you this image because I was thrilled to find this at the Ossining Historical Society. This is a letter that Alfred wrote to his father in 1836. And what I love about it is that it's all about business. It's about purchasing shares and delivering stock certificates and getting some more fire insurance, and how there are not houses to be had in New York City and how expensive the rents are. So some things never change about New York. But I like this so much because it shows that at 24, Alfred was quite a worldly man. He was able to conduct business. He's running his own business as an artist. And this is actually a letter that I have held in my hands that was written by Alfred. So I get a little bit hysterical about this. I'm sorry. All right. So now we're going to talk about the U.S. exploring expedition of 1838 to 1842, also called the United States South Seas Exploring Expedition, also called the Charles Wilkes Expedition. My family is extremely tired of hearing me talk about this expedition, but I'm obsessed with it. This is the largest overseas scientific expedition to sail under any flag that you've probably never heard of. This was led by Lieutenant Charles Wilkes, who studied with Frederick's teacher, John Reuben Smith. The whole stated purpose of this expedition was to extend the bounds of science and to promote knowledge. It was not for conquest, but for discovery. And it was really quite remarkable what they did. It cost over $300,000, which is about $10 million in today's money. They surveyed over 280 islands. They mapped and explored 800 miles of the Oregon coast and the Columbia River, explored 1,500 miles of the Antarctic coast, and actually were the first to discover that Antarctica was a separate landmass, although nobody really believed them until the 1870s. And this really contributed to the rise of science in America. Because of this expedition, we were no longer relying on England and Europe for their maps and charts. And the collection of the specimens that are gathered during this 4-year expedition were sent back. It was over 40 tons. And this was the core of America's first national museum at the Smithsonian Museum. And this was the U.S. government's first foray into scientific work. And fun fact, in 1943, when the Navy was planning their invasion of the island of Tarawa during World War II, the only available chart to the military was Lieutenant Charles Wilkes's chart that he had made in 1840, and that's what they used. So I think America got their money's worth in many ways. So here we have a picture of Charles Wilkes. He was a pretty interesting guy. Fun fact, his mother died when he was very young, and he was raised by his aunt, who was Elizabeth Seton, who was the first American saint. She was sanctified in 1974. But alas, that does not seem to have rubbed off on Charles Wilkes, because most people seem to think of him as conceited, domineering, and arrogant. And this caused him many, many problems. And he was court-martialed many, many times. And unfortunately, really doesn't get a lot of credit for what he did in the US exploring expedition. But here's a dizzying map of where they went on this exploring expedition. They started in Norfolk, Virginia, and just kind of bopped all over the world. And it's really amazing when you think how far they went just in sailing ships, without any sort of way to communicate other than, shooting off their cannons or having lights. It's pretty amazing that they managed to stay together. Here's a slide that I took off the Smithsonian website. This is just a picture of one of the ships. There were 6 of them. There were 2 sloops and a brig, 2 schooners, and a store ship. Of these 6 ships, only 4 of them came back. The Seagull, the schooner, was lost at sea, never to be found again, never to be heard of again. And the Peacock, which our Alfred Agate was actually on, was lost at the mouth of the Columbia River, and Alfred was saved off that ship, and he was carrying as many of his illustrations under his arm that he could when he was taken off. So Alfred was one of 2 illustrators on this expedition. The other one was a man named James Drayton. They were thought to have used the camera lucida to do a lot of their illustrations. Agate would do landscapes and portraits, and Drayton did the botanical and animal illustrations. Sometimes they would work from the sketches of others. For example, the scientifics, of which there were 9, did not go down to Antarctica because that was seen as too dangerous. So they spent their time in Australia and New Zealand. And any pictures we have of that Antarctic portion of this journey were mostly done by Charles Wilkes, who was a fine artist himself, and his pictures would be taken and I guess cleaned up and engraved for when they were published later. There are hundreds and hundreds of sketches and watercolors and oils and engravings that were made. Some of them were published. Some of them are on a naval website, which I'll talk about in a bit. But I'll just show you a few. I could go on. And I will say on Friday, I am giving a talk about the Alfred Agate and the US Exploring Expedition at the Ossining Boat and Canoe Club. So if you really want to get down into it with me, you can hear more on Friday. But here's just one picture. This is from Tokelau, one of the South Sea Islands. This was courtesy of the National Academy of Design. This would have been a painting or a picture that Alfred sent back because he wanted to maintain his membership in the National Academy of Design. So he had to send back at least one painting a year. So this is how the National Academy E-Museum has it. It's a terrible print of it, but just sort of gives you a flavor of the South Seas. Here's another one. This is an Indigenous Australian woman, Kungara, from Illawarra. This is sort of south of Sydney. And while half of the voyagers are down in Antarctica, Alfred and several other of the people went went around Australia and went around New Zealand and made lots and got to see lots of things. And I'm only showing you this one picture, but there are a lot of pictures I could show you about Australia and New Zealand because he really seemed to enjoy that. Here's a picture of Chief Vedovi of Vitu Levi, Fiji. And this is a really kind of horrible story. But this portrait, they sometimes used Alfred Agate, it seems, as a diplomat to make portraits of some of the natives so that they would get them on their side. And so Alfred made this a portrait, and then Charles Wilkes had orders to kidnap this man, Chief Vedovi, because he was in retaliation for the 1834 murder of some crew members who had landed on Fiji. And when they talked to Vedovi and they asked him about this, he was like, yeah, sure, I killed them. Yeah. And he did admit to some cannibalism too, because that was actually something that happened in Fiji. So Wilkes kidnapped him. And when some of the other Fijians said, you can't kidnap our people, he said, well, I have to, I've got to take him back to America. He has to be tried for murder. And then a lot of the other chiefs said, yeah, well, we don't really like Vedovi. That's good. You can keep him. But then his followers didn't like that. And then there was a big massacre. A couple of the USXX crew were murdered on an island called Malolo. One of them was a midshipman who happened to be Charles Wilkes's nephew. So Charles Wilkes then retaliated Vietnam style and burned the village of Malolo to the ground with women and children in it. And it was a pretty horrible affair. So much for not being violent on this trip. Vedovi was taken, he was kidnapped, he was taken back to America, and he was going to be tried. He spent the next 2 years on board ship, and he died the day the ship docked in Brooklyn in 1842. So he was never tried, but he certainly was punished. And supposedly his skull resides in the bowels of the Smithsonian even today, because while they buried him at sea, they took his skull for further research, and nobody knows what happened to it. Moving on from that sad story, get to Hawaii. Alfred Agate got to go into the interior of Hawaii, got to go look at the volcanoes. This is just one of many, many pictures that he made in Hawaii. And then I'll end with this picture here of a Japanese man in Manila. And I like this because it's a nice example of an on-site sketch on the left. And on the right, you see the final published engraving. So Alfred, in 1842, he comes back. I imagine he came back to Sparta and tried to recuperate a little bit. Apparently his health was destroyed by this voyage, but he went back down to DC, where he settled and worked for the Bureau of Engraving to help illustrate Charles Wilkes' narrative of the USXX. In 1845, Alfred marries a woman named Elizabeth Hill Kennedy, but sadly, just a few months later, in 1846, he dies of tuberculosis. Seems to be the family trait, and he's buried in Washington D.C. And a lot of his illustrations went to his wife, who then remarried, and they went to the daughter she had in her second marriage. And that's how the Naval History and Heritage Command has them all, because the daughter gave them to them. So you can look at all of these paintings and sketches online. So that is the story of Alfred Agate. Moving on to Harriet. This is a painting of Harriet Agate Carmichael. We don't know for sure it's Harriet, and we don't know exactly who painted it. It is called Lady of the Agate Family. It was yet another one of those paintings that were found in the attic of 6 Agate Avenue. I want to say it's Harriet. So family legend says it's Harriet, and family legend says that Frederick painted it. That's not enough for the New York Historical Society to change any of their notes, but for our purposes, we're going to say this is Harriet. We don't have that much from Harriet. We do know Harriet was a painter, and the Ossining Historical Society does have this painting of hers, which is just a still life. Doesn't really come out too well on this slide. And mostly the art we have of hers is strictly student work, but we know that she studied with Frederick. We know that she also studied at the National Academy. We know that she even exhibited a painting with the National Academy in 1830 when she was still in her teens. Here's another one of her paintings. It's called A Greek Scene at the Monument of Lysicrates. It is not a great painting. I'm not even going to pretend. This was a student painting probably. This is at the Newark Museum of Art. It's another one of the paintings that was in the attic that ended up at a different place. It was featured actually in a 1965 exhibit that the Newark Museum put together called Women Artists in America, 1707 to 1964. when I was looking at this, you can't really see it so well from this slide, but when you look at it up close, you can see that the two figures in the foreground are actually quite bad and they don't look at all like real people. But the curator, you know, mentioned to me, well, probably Harriet Agate would not have been allowed to take anatomy drawing or live drawing classes. So it's understandable that her figures would not be particularly good. That's just a little insight into what it was like to be an art student and a woman in the 1830s. And then this last one, it's the last painting I have of hers. I don't know for sure that this is hers. I actually only just discovered this on Sunday, thanks to Martha Mazziti, who suggested I look at the website of Historic Hudson Valley. I know that Harriet exhibited a painting called View of Sleepy Hollow in 1833 for the National Academy. And the Historic Hudson Valley has this on their website as artist unknown, but probably painted between 1834 and 1855, something like that. So I think it's entirely possible this could be by Harriet. I need to do more research, but I thought I would just show this painting anyway because I was so excited about it. But those are the only three works we have of Harriet's. We know that in 1838, she married Thomas J. Carmichael, who was a contractor for the Sing Sing portion of the aqueduct. For those of you people who live in Ossining, I'm sure you've seen this ventilator on Spring Street by Park School. If you go right up to it, you can see that this is section 22 of the Croton Aqueduct, and that T.J. Carmichael is the contractor, and that would be Harriet's husband. We know that Harriet had several children, and in 1847, she moves to Jefferson County, Wisconsin with her husband because he wants to have a farm. In 1848, he buys the farm, literally, and dies there. And Harriet spends the next couple of years selling everything off. And then she comes back to Ossining sometime in the 1850s. She probably goes back and lives at 2 Liberty Street, where she lives with her mother, Hannah, and her children until her mother, Hannah, passes away. And from Hannah's will, we can also see that the family was still doing quite well. And Harriet and her one surviving brother, Edward, who was not an artist, so I haven't mentioned him, they inherited most everything, a lot of artwork, they inherited a lot of land, and there was quite a bit of money and insurance money too. So Harriet was left pretty well off. But even before that, I do have one more picture of Harriet, not one that she did, but this is a cut and paste silhouette that would have been made in Saratoga, New York in 1841 by a French silhouette artist named Augustin Edouard. He was apparently quite well known, and Thomas and Harriet must have been doing pretty well to be taking a trip up to Saratoga and paying to have a cut and paste silhouette done of themselves. Ossining Historical has a Xerox of this picture, and they also have a lot of research that was done by a previous owner of this picture. And when I tried to reach out to the previous owner, they had sold it. And I actually reached out to the current owner of it, who does not want to be identified. It's not like they're famous or anything, but I shall not identify them. We will call them an anonymous private donor. But this silhouette is still out there. And I just like it because it just says, I wonder if this is what they looked like, but gives us a little insight, another little insight into Harriet's life. And so she passes away in 1871. She's living with her daughter in Brooklyn at the time, and she is also buried in Sparta Cemetery. And I think her headstone is still there and legible. So that's all I have for you. The last thing I want to show you is my bibliography, just in case you're interested in any of the sources I used. There are a number of things. One I do want to point out, if you have any interest in the United States Exploring Expedition, do read Nathaniel Philbrick's book that he wrote in 2001 called Sea of Glory. It's an excellent, just an excellent story of the USXX. So that's all I have. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. If anybody has any questions, I'm not sure how we want to handle this. If people want to raise their hand, or Martha, do you want to help with this?
Yeah, everybody can unmute themselves, and we can, if you put the viewer selection in your upper right-hand corner on speaker, that person will pop into the center of the screen. Does anybody have any questions for Caroline at this moment? You can also put it in the chat and we'll make sure she gets asked those questions.
Or if you have any corrections, I'd be happy to hear something that I might have gotten wrong or something I don't know about.
Doug?
No, two things. And I think you kept mentioning 6 Agate Avenue, and you showed a picture of that house. Who lives, do you know who lives there now and who lived there?
I do not. I do not know who lives there now. I do know that Mabel Melodia Foster Wood was the granddaughter of Harriet Agate, and she lived at 6 Agate Avenue and moved there in about 1915. So I don't know if the Agates sold to Liberty Street sometime in the early 20th century. I'm not sure of that.
Okay,
Be able
yeah.
to figure that out through a land deed search.
Yeah, that
yeah.
just didn't get a chance to do that.
I wonder if Vandelet, did he buy it?
I don't know if he bought it, but he certainly did some work on it when he did his little,
Yeah.
renovation.
I don't know if he bought it from them or afterwards. And then
I'll look that up.
and then there was one other thing, which is, so on the side of 2 Liberty Street and on the side of a lot of houses on Liberty Street, there are these porches. And when we bought our house on Liberty Street, we were told that that porch was called a tuberculosis room, and that the windows actually opened like down almost in, Rochelle's sitting in it right now, but those windows went down into the wall so that the air could come into those rooms. So I don't know that much more about it, but you
Wow.
mentioned it, and they came back with tuberculosis to that house, I think, to have the air in those rooms. So that's the one thing I knew.
Tuberculosis
I know.
porch. Wow.
Yeah, and we all have them on our block here. So who knows
Wow.
what's recuperated. But
Thank you for that.
I was a little curious, you may have said so already, but what is the connection to Newark? That some of these paintings ended up in Newark. Do you have any idea?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not quite sure why Newark. I know that the New York Historical Society didn't want all of the paintings. And so the Ossining was holding on to them, but because Newark was planning to do an exhibit about women artists, somehow they got connected with the Ossining Historical Society, and somehow the Ossining Historical Society managed to convince them to take some of these paintings. That's about as much as I can tell.
Okay, thank you.
Why were they well known enough to have a street named after them? Well, I think a lot of the streets were named after the people who lived there or who owned a lot of property on that street. And I know that Thomas Agate certainly was buying up property in the 1830s. So I haven't dug back into the land deeds, but I assume that, 6 Agate was a piece of property that they owned, and that house was built in about the 1890s. So who knows what was there before. Yeah, I don't know if it's that they were important, but I think they just owned some land there.
There's an earlier question on the chat, which is fascinating talk. Were the Agates unusual in being successful artists based in Sparta? Were there other artists in the area who might also have been of a non-pernicious character?
I don't know what that means. I didn't think they were pernicious characters. I don't know. I mean, I just stumbled upon the Agates as Sparta artists. I'm sure there were others, but they were the 3 that I found that seemed to have been most successful and really were at sort of the forefront of American art. Anybody else?
Anybody else? Well, Caroline, thank you for this wonderful, wonderful presentation. They certainly went far and wide, and something to be proud of from Sparta. So thank you very much. One last shot for any other questions before we let Caroline go.
Well, thank you all so much for
Thank
putting up
you.
with this. Like I said, I'm obsessed with this. And if you want to know more about Alfred, I'm giving another talk at the Ossining Boat and Canoe Club on Friday.
When do you,
So
what time is that on Friday?
that's at 7 o'clock.
All right. Thank
All
you so
right.
much, Caroline. We
you.
really appreciate
All
it.
right. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.